Welcome back to Traffic Jam Live News. Traffic Jam Live shines a spotlight on the shadows of human trafficking. So few people realize how serious the situation is for young girls, children under the age of 18 here in the United States. Disrupting and dismantling human trafficking requires teamwork. There's a thing called Metcalfe's Law, which implies that the power, the value of the network is proportional to the squared number of people in that network. You make a difference. Be part of that network. If you're new or relatively new to Traffic Jam Live, we encourage you to subscribe, like, share posts of other anti-trafficking organizations. You do make a difference. You add power to that network. So won't you join in and let's jam human trafficking together. Today, we've got Lori Cohen, CEO from ECPAT USA, and being interviewed with Sophia Flot-Warner. Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks, Bo. Well, our guest today is Lori Cohen. She is the CEO of ECPAT USA. She joined ECPAT USA in November 2019. But prior to that, she founded the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families in New York. She has garnered international recognition, assisting immigrants and domestic violence victims of human trafficking, including children. Lori's experience representing victims moved her to advocate for anti-trafficking policy on federal, state, and local levels. She has conducted trainings in the U.S. and abroad for attorneys, prosecutors, judges, social service providers, healthcare professionals, and financial service providers. Lori is the expert, and we are so delighted to have her with us here today on Traffic Jam Live. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this really important conversation.
Thank you, Lori. Again, as I said, we are thrilled to have you with us. So let's just dive right in. We want to start with your story. What motivated you to start the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary?
It's such a good question, and I'm a lawyer by training, and I remember when I was at law school, one of our professors told us that we might have ideas about what we were planning to do with our career, but it would be totally different. And that was the case for me, because I actually did not know what trafficking was until I started representing trafficking victims. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I was working as an attorney at Sanctuary for Families, which is a very prominent domestic violence center in New York City. And because I speak Spanish and I have a background in immigration law, I was asked to help Spanish-speaking victims of domestic violence. And as I was interviewing my clients, they would mention, in addition to things that we might expect a domestic violence victim to suffer, that they were being beaten, that they were being shamed, that they were being threatened. In addition, a number of the women started telling me that, and they were being sold to other men for sex. And they didn't, and in many cases, they were domestic violence victims because when they refused, they would be beaten. And in one case, particularly, the boyfriend was forcing her to have sex with other people for money, and then raping her and beating her after, because he was jealous that she was cheating on him. And she became pregnant as a result of these rapes. She was quite religious, and abortion was against her faith. And she fled, not initially because he was beating her and raping her, but because he was going to force her to abort the baby, and she refused to do it. And she fled to protect this baby. And that's when I realized that this was not I don't want to say not simply domestic violence, because domestic violence is so atrocious, but there was something else going on. And I had to get educated very quickly because my clients' lives were really depending upon it. And that's when I became educated. I have to say, my teachers were my clients, my teachers were victims. And that dynamic has really informed my professional work in the anti-trafficking field.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that with us. So, how did you get connected with ECPAT USA?
I had been representing trafficking victims for over a decade. I initially started working with Spanish-speaking immigrants, but then started working with immigrants from other countries, and then grew to learn that this was a serious problem in the United States, not just for immigrants, but for US citizens. And I became much more involved in policy work because at that point, a lot of the policy discussion had focused abroad, had focused on looking at trafficking that was happening in other countries and looking at trafficking in the United States to the extent that it involved immigrants, but not children who were being sold for sex on the street. Those were not trafficking victims, those were child prostitutes. And those children were being arrested. And I became extremely interested in the work that ECPAT USA had been doing now for 30 years. They were pioneers to say those children on the streets, those children are trafficking victims. We should be helping them. We shouldn't be arresting them. And I was so impressed with the advocacy work that they were doing, and really the thought leadership in this field, that when the founder, my predecessor, announced her retirement, I threw my hat in the ring, and I'm delighted to be following her in her footsteps.
Awesome, thanks. So let's get to something exciting. You have a big event coming up in June.
Yes, we do.
Tell our audience all about the ECPAT USA Freedom Awards.
We are extremely excited about these awards. ECPAT USA has an annual award that we give to leaders in the anti-trafficking movement, to visionaries, to people who really share our value in joining together and saying no child should ever be bought or sold or used for sex. And so this year we're very excited to announce that we have 3 honorees. The first honoree is a renowned and highly respected survivor, Tina Front, who founded Courtney's House. Tina is a pioneer in this field. She's the first African-American survivor to found an anti-trafficking organization and a safe home, does a lot of policy work, and has been just really changing the way we think about trafficking, particularly vulnerable youth who are being exploited but not being identified. Our next honoree is a police officer, which is a very interesting honoree in this year when we're talking about what is the role of law enforcement and criminal justice generally. Her name is Rose Muckenthaler. She is a force of nature. She is somebody who puts herself out on the streets, literally puts herself out on the streets every day. She, for years, when she started as a more junior detective, she was out on the tracks, dressed as somebody to be sold for prostitution so that she could do really in-depth investigations. But Rose Muckenthaler is no longer out on the streets, but really she's engaging in victim intervention, victim identification, meeting with girls, talking to them very early on, and also doing a lot of important prevention work. She has, we talk about rescue, and there's some concern about a rescue narrative, but this really is a detective who has rescued girls and has saved lives. And I've seen it. I've seen also her do really effective interventions just by speaking to children, by educating them, by letting them understand that these promises this boyfriend is making are not really what it's what the reality is. And then our third honoree is very exciting. A pillar of ECPAT USA's work is engaging the private sector. And very often anti-trafficking organizations don't think about how can we work with the private sector to move the needle. And ECPAT USA has done work with the American Hotel and Lodging Association. So we are honoring their CEO, Chip Rogers, who has been a visionary in this field. He has been, even prior to joining the American Hotel and Lodging Association, he raised a tremendous amount of awareness about the vulnerabilities of hotels if they're not alert to preventing trafficking. And he worked very closely with ECPAT USA to offer a free online training for the industry. We had 400,000 people sign up to take this online training last year, really thanks in large part to his vision. So really looking at this from three very different angles, but it's important to acknowledge that all of them have a role in preventing trafficking.
My goodness, that sounds like an amazing lineup of honorees. Thank you for sharing that with us. We'll talk a little bit more about it a little later, so we can tell everybody how to be a part of it. So let's back up a little bit. In March, ECPAT had a parallel event to the United Nations 65th Commission on the Status of Women. Would you give us a recap of the panel on leaving no child behind?
Yes, thank you. It was an event that we were very honored to host and present with the UN community. We were really looking at who is trafficked, who are the trafficking victims, and trying to raise awareness that trafficking victims very often are coming from vulnerable and marginalized communities. And we wanted to say the vulnerabilities that make children susceptible to being trafficked also make identification that much more difficult. So we presented a range of speakers, and we included ECPAT USA's Director of Education to talk about working with children in school districts that are seen to be more at risk to recruitment by traffickers. So school districts where there may be a high level of homelessness, there may be a high level of children coming out of foster care, there may be a high level of, for example, one school district we're working with right now has a very high percentage of unaccompanied minor children from Central America who might be vulnerable to gang recruitment and exploitation. And talking about going into those schools, training the educators, training the social workers, and developing programs to educate children so that they have tools to protect themselves. Another panelist involved partners who we're working with in Russia, who are working with children in orphanages. So there's unfortunately a very high percentage of children who come out of either foster care or orphanage situations. And in Russia, a number of those children have disabilities. And we know from the research that children with disabilities also are at a much higher rate of sexual exploitation and grooming for trafficking. And again, because these are children who might have limited communication skills, it's harder for them to even explain what's happening. So we also included a gentleman from UNICEF who talked about really transformative work that they were doing to educate boys on healthy relationships. And I was really impressed. He talked about challenging patriarchal systems that don't value girls, and how do we create a stronger sense of equality. And then we had a survivor from ECPAT USA's Survivors Council. The Survivors Council, as I mentioned before, so much of my knowledge about this issue is drawn from working with survivors. And ECPAT USA's Survivors Council is created of a range of individuals from different backgrounds so that we have a broader understanding of what does trafficking look like in different communities. This is an Indigenous woman who really shed the spotlight on the trafficking of Native women in Minnesota and talked about the vulnerabilities and talked about, frankly, the very challenging history we have in the United States of Native peoples being trafficked for sex, and her work in trying to create some interventions and also some supportive models for survivors.
It sounds like a very powerful panel that you had there. And I hope that some really great solutions come out of that. So you can keep us informed. Maybe you can come back and tell us all about what evolved out of that.
Thank you.
So your organization offers some really awesome programs. Which do you find is currently having the most impact?
There are 4 pillars. We used to say there were 3 pillars of our work. We've just added a 4th. So there's education, there's advocacy, which is how I became initially connected to ECPAT USA. There's private sector engagement, which is extremely powerful. And then we've added community engagement, that we feel that we want to have the general public involved, and we want to create a community of activists. Well, there are two big contenders. So community engagement, we've just started, we're building, there's a lot of excitement about it. But private sector engagement, as I mentioned, we worked with the American Hotel and Lodging Association and trained 400,000 people during a time when the travel and hospitality industry had collapsed. And we felt that despite the economic challenges that hotels were facing, there was more of an urgent opportunity to provide training, because there's so much more of a risk of kids being trafficked now that, law enforcement is, I found that many of the officers who were investigating cases normally were out sick with COVID. People were being detailed to other units to sort of an all hands on deck crisis situation. And hotels were really short staffed. They didn't have staff, they didn't have security, they didn't even have people at the front desk in many cases. So to provide training was really impactful. The other piece, which I think was driven by COVID, is the educational program. And I'm extremely excited about the work that we have done this year, because schools were reaching out to us and telling us that their children were being recruited online for sex, and that this was an early concern that ECPAT USA flagged in March when we first heard about school closings. We knew kids were going to be recruited. We responded very quickly by modifying an in-class curriculum that we had to go to a virtual format, and started letting schools know we were there. And schools have been contacting us. I mean, it's very sadly, kids are getting recruited. So we have been working really diligently with school districts to make sure that their students are safe.
That sounds amazing. Like a lot of work.
We have a great team. They're working really hard. People, I think there was a pre-pandemic, there was a fear that if people work from home, they're just going to be on vacation all the time. I can tell you, our staff is working around the clock. It doesn't stop. And, we try to tell them practice self-care, take some time off, but they're just so driven to protect children. It's really quite exciting to be working with this team.
Lori, that sounds like some really significant impact. Thank you for sharing all of those details with us. You mentioned earlier the Survivors Council. Would you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, the Survivors Council is a very distinguishing factor in ECPAT USA's work. Very early on, ECPAT USA realized that for us to be impactful, we really needed to speak to the true experts in this field. And the true experts are people who have survived child sex trafficking and exploitation. And it would be unethical of us to make policy recommendations, to talk about best practices, to teach children how to protect themselves without bringing in the true experts on this topic. And so we continue to work with a council. Now we have about 15 individuals who are now adults but had survived child sex trafficking and exploitation. And when any development arises, we consult with them. And it's significant to say that also we consult with them and we pay them for their expertise. And I think that is something that the anti-trafficking movement is starting to recognize, that we can't reasonably expect survivors to share their lived experience, to share their wisdom and not get paid for it, because we're all benefiting from their wisdom.
I think that's beautiful. I love the way that you have brought in the people who have lived this, and you're showing appreciation for their experiences, for their wisdom and insight. I love it. I love it. So you have another event coming up called the Survivor Solidarity Ride. Would you give our audience an idea of what that is?
This event, the Survivor Solidarity Ride, is a wonderful development that grew out of the pandemic. So it's as devastating as the pandemic has been. It's been interesting to see how when we adapt to address a challenge, we can look at some of this as a growth opportunity. ECPAT USA had typically participated in New York City, an event called the 5-Borough Bike Ride, and it is sponsored by TD Bank, and it's a very fun event, and it goes through all 5 boroughs of New York City, and we don't have counties, we have boroughs, and the streets are closed, and it's a very fun day to ride around the city, and the streets are closed. Last year, the event was canceled because of the pandemic, and ECPAT USA was in a bit of a bind because we had riders who had signed up to do a fundraiser for ECPAT USA. We were a designated charity for the ride, and people were riding to support the organization. And our staff sat down and said, what could we do instead of the 5-Borough Bike Ride? How can we do something? Do we just cancel it? Do we not do anything? And I thought about it, and having represented so many survivors of child sex trafficking in New York City, I thought, you know what? I actually have clients, and I've worked with people who have been trafficked in every part of New York City. And maybe we should use this as an opportunity to raise awareness that it could be fun. It could be a good day to get exercise. It could be a fundraiser, but it could be an educational opportunity. And so I called the members of my Survivors Council, and I interviewed almost all of them and said, tell me where you were trafficked. And then I mapped out a route of all 5 boroughs. And we started in Hunts Point in the Bronx, which is a warehouse district. There's a tremendous amount of trafficking that happens there. And it might be the kind of location where if you were making a movie about sex trafficking, you might expect that to happen there. But I also then took everybody to Fifth Avenue and in front of the Plaza Hotel, where another survivor talked about being trafficked up and down Fifth Avenue at some of the fanciest hotels in New York City. And then we went to Queens, and we went to a very quiet residential neighborhood in Brooklyn. And then we went over to Staten Island, and people think, oh, trafficking doesn't happen in Staten Island. And we talked about being trafficked in Staten Island. So we stopped at each point and had narrations by survivors and really raised awareness through a big social media campaign. And I think in some ways it was more successful because it tied in with the mission of who we are, and that we're survivor informed. And we really wanted people to understand that this is a problem that exists everywhere. So we are doing it again this May. We're doing it Memorial Day. And we are going to a place that New Yorkers never think sex trafficking is going to happen. We're taking it to the Hamptons. We're going out to Long Island. We're going to areas where we're going to be starting at a jail where I met an incarcerated girl who it turned out had been trafficked. And we are then going around to neighborhoods where people think this doesn't happen. So I'm very excited. It's another opportunity to raise awareness in a beautiful location and see this, see the sand and the waves, but also learn that this is something that you can go to the beach, but you can't hide from the reality. This is happening everywhere.
Wow, that is so innovative. I love the way that you guys pivoted and came up with something inspiring to do in the midst of what could have been, really bad situation of not being able to fundraise. So if a company wants to be a sponsor or an individual wants to be a writer, how would they go about making that happen?
If they reach us at info@ecpatusa.org, we would love to have sponsors for our benefit. It's or for the Freedom Awards, which is serving us our annual benefit, and for the bike ride. And we are taking riders in New York, but also we're helping individuals if they don't live in New York and they do want to ride. We are having satellite rides taking place in other parts of the country, and people are also free to start their own ride or do their own activity, and we'll happily bring you along in the social media campaign. So it doesn't need to be limited to one community, and that's the point. It's happening everywhere.
All right, so let's get a little bit serious right now. What would you tell any person who's watching that's caught up in this world of human trafficking? And if you would give us 3 perspectives, what would you say to the trafficked? What would you say to the trafficker? And what would you say to the buyer?
I'm so glad that you asked about all 3, because so frequently those 3 are not addressed. Only 2 of the 3 are addressed. So what I would say to the trafficked person is that you are not alone. It's not your fault, and help is available. So often victims blame themselves, and they feel that they did something to deserve this, or even that they made a bad choice, and because they made a bad choice, they should be punished, or they don't deserve a second chance. And what I've had to do with many clients is sort of explain to them, actually, this wasn't a choice. You were not given an option. And if your choice was do this or die, that is not a choice. And so I think we need to not shame victims, not make them feel that they're stupid or a bad person, but they are a normal human being who was put into a difficult situation, and that they are worthy of seeking help, that they are worthy of helping themselves. And I want to be very clear that, I'm not going to go, and ECPAT USA is not going to go and say, we're going to save you, because I believe very much that these victims need to have the ability to say to themselves, I deserve to have my life back. And my survivors all rescued themselves, right? They rescued themselves. There is a national human trafficking hotline. That number is 888-373-7888. And there's also an ability to text, and they can message, it's 233-733, and then they would text help or text info. And so I would say the National Human Trafficking Hotline is a way to report it, but even before they start reporting it to get help, it's really recognizing they're not alone and people are here to help them. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say to the trafficker is, this is not a risk-free enterprise. It is an extremely profitable enterprise, but at the end of the day, you are exploiting people, And if you are a trafficker who is like the traffickers of many of my clients, you're going to spend life in jail, which is what's happening now. So, there's no justification for it. A lot of these traffickers have persuaded themselves that they're in some kind of partnership with the people they're trafficking. It's not a partnership. They're making all the money. I mean, I had so many clients who said that when their trafficker told them they had to engage in sex in exchange for money, it was framed as, we need to do this. There's no we. It's the trafficker setting it up for his victim. And there is no we. And it just struck me again and again that traffickers are really master manipulators, and in many cases really brainwash their victims into believing they didn't have a choice. So I would say, you're not going to get away with it at the end of the day. And that, there is no justification in exploiting another human life. What I would say to the buyers is, you are driving this industry. You are the ones who are, infusing this illegal enterprise with the cash to keep it going. And if you think it's harmless, you're kidding yourself.
So let's go back and talk a little bit more about your Freedom Awards. If someone wants to get involved or to be a part of it, to donate, how could they find out more information?
ECPAT USA's Freedom Awards are scheduled to be held virtually. It's a first for us, on June 15th from 7 to 8 p.m. And the host for the Freedom Awards is the really remarkable and inspiring New York One anchor and senior reporter Cheryl Wills. And she'll be leading us through the evening in what I expect will be entertaining. It will be educational and inspiring, and will help support ECPAT USA's work to continue to raise awareness about best practices to protect children, and different ways to become involved. If you want to email us again at info@ecpatusa.org. We have a very wonderful and exciting benefit committee. We would love to have people join the benefit committee. We're engaging sponsors. If there are either individuals or organizations that wish to sponsor us, we're very excited to highlight the generosity of our supporters. And we will be also offering tickets if individuals want to purchase individual tickets. We're also having a silent auction. So we have a number of really exciting items for sale, for bidding at the silent auction, but we're also welcoming additional donations for the auction. So again, I would encourage people to go to our website, www.ecpatusa.org, and find the link for the auction and come join us.
Awesome. It sounds like a beautiful event. I'm excited for you. So let's close this out on a high note. Would you share with us, Lori, a victory, a good story, a good outcome that you and your organization have recently experienced?
I'd love to. Last year, when George Floyd was murdered, we really thought deeply about how to respond to his killing. And I reached out to our Survivors Council and I asked them, can you share with us thoughts about law enforcement, about racial justice, about trafficking, and how all these things come together? And can you share your thoughts with us? And they did. It was quite profound. We did a blog series with the voices of survivors, sharing their own experiences and their views on it. And it was very exciting to me, and it was very authentic. And I think it was kind of a rich conversation that we don't normally have a chance to engage in. So there's some interesting things that came out of that as we were unveiling this series week by week, and we did it for about 2.5 months. I was contacted by a man, and he said, "Are you not interested in helping men? Men and boys were trafficked, aren't you?" Because the survivors that we had listed in the series were women. And he said, "I was trafficked as a boy, and the only organization when I was growing up, and I realized what had happened to me, the only organization I could turn to that had acknowledged that boys could be trafficked was ECPAT USA. And I noticed you're focusing on women, you're not talking about boys. And I'm very sad if you're not focusing on boys anymore." And I said, "No, absolutely. We're focusing. Boys are also being trafficked, and we're really serious about this." And I realized he was right in that, not that we were not focusing on boys, but that there really weren't other organizations in this field that were comfortable talking about this issue, even though when ECPAT USA started talking about boys, it was probably 20 years ago that we began to talk about the exploitation of boys. And so we continued the conversation, and I could see that this really meant a lot to him. And so I said, "Would you like to join our Survivors Council?" And he did. And then he wrote a blog post in the fall talking about his own experience serving in the military and seeing boys being sex trafficked while he was stationed in Afghanistan, and realizing that this was a global concern. So I think for us, it's having the ability to go into very difficult and painful spaces and addressing really challenging issues, but making an effort and really investing ourselves in having meaningful conversations and respectful conversations, and listening to the voices and trying to be inclusive. And so I am hopeful that as we continue to do this work, that we continue to build this movement, that we continue to bring as many different perspectives in to join us, and that we continue to turn to survivors for guidance. So it's such a delight for me to be in this space. And and people say to me, "Don't you get depressed?" And I don't get depressed. I get energized, because I just see the most amazing people who are just so committed to protecting children. And I feel very fortunate to be part of such an inspiring community.
Well, Lori, this has been a super amazing time for me. I am so impressed. I'm touched by all the work that you're doing, by the passion that I hear in you as you share your stories. And we just can't tell you how much we appreciate you sharing all of this with our audiences. And thank you so much for all of the work that you do. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I want to thank you, Sophia, for continuing to raise awareness about this, and for sharing these thoughts with your audience. It's so important and really wonderful for you to share this platform.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today on Traffic Jam Live.